Welcome to When Music Meets Mindfulness. I'm your host, Vania Chan. Our featured guest today is Conductor David Fallis, one of Canada's leading interpreters of operatic and choral orchestra repertoire. David, thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
I'm fine. Nice to see you, and thanks for inviting me.
Nice to see you too, and thank you for being here. So let's jump into this interview and start with our first topic, calming the mind. What are some activities that calm your mind, heighten awareness, and bring your focus to the present moment?
There's nothing like a good night's sleep, I find, which is, a very basic thing. And sleep is one of those things when it works, and it works beautifully, and you wake up refreshed, and you think, "Oh, I'm ready to face the day," and calmly, and it's sort of. And then if it doesn't, it can be a kind of downward spiral because you think, "Oh, I'm not getting enough sleep. I'm going to be anxious tomorrow," or whatever. So I do find that it's important to get good sleep if I can, which I do by making sure that I have routines that I do and not working just till the last minute and then expecting to turn off, which always is a challenge for a musician because, of course, you're often performing at night. So it's one of those things. But I do like walking a great deal. I find walking a very kind of meditative activity. And I mean, I'll walk to appointments, but even just to go for a walk where you're just not going anywhere in particular and, trying a different route. And sometimes that's a good thing to do just before going to bed, I find, is I'll just go for even just 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah, helps to clear the mind, especially since we usually have so much music flowing in our heads, and it's hard to turn the earworms off sometimes. Yeah.
Yes.
Let's move on to our next topic, organizing our thoughts. So, David, you are known for your work in Baroque, classical, and contemporary music, and I've had the pleasure of working with you on several projects. I'm very lucky to do so. And many of those have involved tackling new contemporary music. For instance, composers such as Claude Vivier and Murray Schafer write their compositions out in unconventional ways. How do you begin to analyze and dissect a composition to understand what the composer wants? And then when working with other musicians, how do you guide them through a piece of music that might look intimidating at first glance?
Yeah, well, it's true that contemporary music can look intimidating at first glance. You mentioned, say, Murray Schafer, for instance. I try and put myself in the composer's position and say, well, what were they trying to express on the page? Notation is always only an approximation, really. You can never capture every nuance of a beautiful musical performance. But clearly the composer has certain things that they want to emphasize. And I do find that Murray's graphic notation, as it's often called, is actually very meaningful, and he's not being just capricious. And if you can take the time to figure out what sort of sounds he has in mind, then that's the key, I think, to being able to help others be guided through it. Sometimes I say that I find contemporary music a bit like a puzzle. And I sort of like to do puzzles from time to time. I'm not a real master at any of these things, but if it were a little word puzzle or a number puzzle or something, I enjoy from time to time. And, there's that sort of feeling, and this is why people like puzzles, because you get a little pleasure when you figure it out. Now, puzzles, you can quite, once the crossword is done, you think, oh yes, the crossword is done. And music isn't like that. But there is often a sense that you just need to work with it and look at it, and sometimes you have to come back to it the next day and so on, and look at it a number of times. And as I said, with most composers, and certainly good composers, there is some real logic in it, and there's something that they're trying to communicate, and sometimes it takes a little bit of working to do that. But I find that's the most important thing in terms of guiding others. You mentioned Claude Vivier. He also wrote in various styles, often actually in much more traditional notation, but in some cases, pieces where it was a little bit pretty unclear. Oh, you remember,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
love songs and things like that, and not very clear. And sometimes you even just have to decide and make make a decision that may not be the right one, if you know what I mean. You have to have a
Hmm.
kind of ability that, well, okay, somebody else might do this differently, but I think this is working, and I think this is at least one of the ways the composer might have intended it. You spend it sounds like a terrible word, but analysis. For instance, recently we were doing another piece by Murray Schafer, and some of the pitches seemed very unusual, but I sort of looked at it enough to know that it was actually all fitting within a kind of scale. It wasn't a major scale or a minor scale, but it all did fit in within a kind of unusual scale. And so we just sort of learned that scale as a bit of an exercise so that you got a little sense of where the notes, where there's the tones and where there's the semitones or even thirds and so on. And um, and so that helped, I think, in sort of, you didn't have to know exactly what kind of scale it was or anything, but the singers had it in their mind's ear that there was a pattern to it. Um, and often that will help too. And, with complex pitches or sometimes with strange chords, and they're, many note chords are often a combination of two or three simpler chords. And so if you can sort of say, well, there's these three notes which make this chord, and there's another three notes which make this chord, and together they sound like this, that sometimes helps. So that kind of, again, like that sort of idea of a little key that unlocks the puzzle to a certain extent. Um, and then, practice.
Practice, always practice. But
Always
I love that example that you gave because in truth, it's working with the habitual patterns that we have, like at the traditional way that we've learned music, how to learn music. And then sometimes that feels like a limitation because when it's presented in a form that's other than what we're used to, there's
yeah,
that intimidating feeling. But then, as you said, it's sort of working with how our brains work and defining that scale, which is a repetitive pattern in some ways that will stick within our minds or what our minds will accept, and
hmm
then thereby that being sort of a passageway into the music. I
sorry.
think that's a really great example because we are always working with patterns of behavior that we have in life, and
Yes, yes.
how do we adjust every day, right? So
Right. Yeah, then you can only break your patterns so far, really. And in some ways, if you can use a pattern that you already know to help you into a new pattern, it's not a matter of breaking the old one completely. You're kind of saying, well, let's just expand on this. We understand the idea of a home note in a scale, say, but now we're going to say that the way that home note works with the other notes in the scale is a little different than we're used to, but it still has that basic sort of centering idea.
let's move on to our final topic, which is flow. Psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi was known for his research of flow, the psychology of optimal experience. To quote Csikszentmihalyi, the optimal state of inner experience is one in which there's order in consciousness. The pursuit of a goal brings order in awareness because a person must concentrate attention on the task at hand and momentarily forget everything else. These periods of struggling to overcome challenges are what people find to be the most enjoyable times of their lives. By stretching skills, by reaching toward higher challenges, such a person becomes an increasingly extraordinary individual. So, David, what are your thoughts on this statement by Csikszentmihalyi?
Well, it's a fascinating idea. I never know what to think of when it ends with an increasingly extraordinary individual. But we're all
It's quite
trying to
an
be
epic statement.
extraordinary
Yes.
individuals. I mean, I guess we're all extraordinary individuals, yeah, and we're none of us ordinary. It's true. Um, this idea of concentration on the task at hand and momentarily forgetting everything else. It's true. You really have to focus on the musical goals that we are aiming for. I find that in rehearsals especially. It's interesting as a conductor or leading in rehearsals, you are both sort of leading, but you're also always having to make sure that you're listening. Once in a while, I find I have to just make sure that I'm listening, almost dispassionately, like as if you're a listener from the outside, and hearing what everyone is doing and all the sounds they're making. You do that for many reasons. I mean, the musical reasons are the most important, but even just, things that aren't together or things that aren't in tune. There is a sense that you have to be aware of the sounds around you, because it's easy to almost not hear them all. Sometimes you just hear what you want to hear, or and I do find that I sometimes will say, well, I'm going to make quite deliberately this time. I'm going to, as we rehearse a section again, I'm going to make sure I'm hearing, say, the tenor line or the bass line or the viola part or whatever it is that you suddenly think, I'm not sure really I've been paying that the attention that I should. But I do think that that this periods, when he says periods of struggling to overcome challenges, are what people find to be the most enjoyable times. There certainly are enjoyable times, because when you've had, especially as you say with contemporary music, where there are these distinct challenges, if you feel like you've sort of figured them out and you've helped others figure it out, and it's actually beginning to sound, and it can sound quite, sometimes it can sound challenging things still. Sometimes it sounds easy, suddenly it sounds easy, and you want that, I suppose. But it's also sometimes you think, whoa, this was a real virtuoso effect that we've been able to achieve. And there's a kind of thrill in that is one of the things that is very fulfilling in when you've chosen music, or in any kind of performing, or any artistic venture, well, in any kind of venture at all, when you've set yourself a challenge and been able to reach it or meet it. In a performance, you just have to give yourself all, in a way. But in rehearsal, as a conductor, you have a responsibility to maintain a certain, you're going to be the ears, in a way.
We're always engaged in the task of listening and performing music, but as you said, there are times where you're engaged in leading us, say, through a run of the piece, but then there are times where you'd like to just sit back and hear it, and so that you can really sort of from the audience's perspective hear what is being performed, and therefore perhaps find another aspect to address that could easily be overlooked if we were always just engaged as performers altogether.
Yes, and I mean, every performer really has to do that. I'm sure we've all had the experience of wonderful performers, but some of them aren't really listening to what's going on around them. And that's a problem for any performing musician. You can't always hear everything going on, but you have to listen to certain things, and yet you're also having to play your own instrument or sing your own line. And I mean, it's especially challenging for singers, because, of course, they don't hear in their own head exactly what they're sounding like, or what they're hearing from outside is mixed with their own voice together. And so that's to sort of integrate those aspects of the music making, I think, is a particular challenge for singers. But every performer needs to have that way of being able to concentrate on the task of their own line, which can sometimes be very challenging and very difficult, but at the same time hearing and listening to what's going on around them from their colleagues.
Thank you again, David, for being here and for sharing with us your wisdom, insight, and mindful process in analyzing and preparing music. To our audience, thank you for tuning in. See you next time on When Music Meets Mindfulness.
I've always considered myself, and those of us that can, be in music, doing so much music in their lives, very fortunate and very lucky. I've always thought that was a blessing. And it's partly because, when you speak of new challenges, you will never exhaust the challenges of music. I mean, if you think you've suddenly, you've covered every kind of music, well, think, oh, well, I know a lot about, I don't know, Baroque music or something. Well, try some other kind of, try some 21st century music or whatever. And that's what, but you will never, or try, performing with a jazz musician, or try performing with a South Indian drummer or something. You can stretch yourselves in so many ways, and the challenges of music are endless.